This weekend represents the traditional beginning of summer in the United States, the three-day weekend that's called Memorial Day. But of course, Memorial Day was not created as a way to commemorate the beginning of summer. It was created as the day that the nation sets aside to remember its war dead. It is a tradition with a long and powerful history, a history that deserves to be remembered. The tradition of decorating soldiers' graves with flowers is ancient. Ancient Greeks performed rituals over soldiers' graves that included the placement of flowers. If the flowers took root and bloomed, that was believed to be a sign that the warrior's soul had found happiness in the next world. The Romans observed a 9-day ritual called Parentalia that honored family ancestors and included the decoration of familial tombs with flowers. As part of the festival, roses and violets were placed on the tombs of fallen soldiers. The origins of Memorial Day in the United States, which was originally called Decoration Day, are actually a matter of some dispute, but there are parts of the story that are agreed upon. The first nationwide observance of the day was in 1868. John Alexander Logan, a major general in the Union Army during the Civil War, and in 1868 Commander-in-Chief of the Grand Army of the Republic, a fraternal order of Civil War Union veterans, issued a proclamation calling for a Decoration Day to be observed annually and nationwide as a day to decorate the graves of Civil War dead, both Union and Confederate. The date of the observance was chosen to be May 30th, because that was a day that was not the anniversary of any major battle of the war, and yet flowers to decorate the graves would be in bloom all across the country. On the first nationally recognized Decoration Day, in 1868, events were held in 183 cemeteries in 27 states. The role that John A. Logan, who was, in addition to being a Major General and Commander-in-Chief of the Grand Army of the Republic, also a U.S. Congressman, U.S. Senator, and unsuccessful candidate for Vice President of the United States, in creating a day to decorate the graves of war dead is particularly poignant. His son, Army Major John Alexander Logan, Jr., was killed in combat on November 11, 1899, while leading his troops during the Philippine-American War. For the action, he was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, one of the nation's heroes, whose sacrifices are memorialized on the holiday, which his father played a central role in establishing. After the First World War, the meaning of the day was changed to memorialize all Americans who died in the service of their country, rather than just Civil War dead. It wasn't until after the Second World War that the name was more commonly recognized as Memorial Day, rather than Decoration Day. The Uniform Monday Holiday Act, enacted in 1968, officially changed Memorial Day to the last Monday in May, rather than always occurring on May 30th. The purpose of the act was to maximize 3-day weekends for federal employees, and that decision is still controversial. Some people argue that by always making Memorial Day a 3-day weekend, it changed the meaning of the day, so that now it is more of a leisure time to celebrate the beginning of summer, rather than a somber time set aside to remember the nation's war dead. There are several competing claims as to which community began the idea of a Decoration Day. In fact, more than 24 communities in both the North and the South lay claim to the idea that they were the first community to set aside community time to decorate Civil War graves. The sheer number of Americans killed during this period led to many acts of community mourning. One candidate for the genesis of the holiday has been advanced by Yale University historian David Blight, who uncovered lost evidence of an event in Charleston, South Carolina on May the 1st of 1865. February 15th of that year, Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard ordered the evacuation of Confederate forces from the city of Charleston in the face of the campaign of Union General William Tecumseh Sherman. The city's white population had largely evacuated, but thousands of black former slaves remained. Symbolically, the first Union troops to enter the city were black troops of the 21st Infantry Regiment and the 55th Massachusetts Infantry. On May the 1st, black workmen dug up and then properly reinterred the bodies of 257 Union soldiers who had died in a Confederate prisoner of war camp in Charleston and who had been improperly buried in a hastily dug mass grave. The memorial was then celebrated by a parade of schoolchildren, citizens, and Union soldiers. Thus, Blight argues, Memorial Day was founded by African Americans in a ritual of remembrance and consecration that represented the fact that the Civil War was a victory of emancipation over a slaveholding republic. When the white aristocracy returned to Charleston, memory of the event was actively suppressed, and it essentially was lost to history until Blight rediscovered it in old period newspapers. While there is clear record that the event occurred, and it was undoubtedly an important event, the problem with Blight's claim that it was the foundation of Memorial Day is that it wasn't well known throughout the country, and thus was not likely to have inspired Logan to create the National Annual Remembrance in 1868. Still, it is an important part of the U.S. Memorial Day tradition, and it deserves to be remembered. Another candidate for the origin of the day occurred in Columbus, Georgia in 1866. While this may not have been the first time that a community in the South set aside time to decorate the graves of war dead, what gained national attention at the time was the fact that the community decorated the graves of both Confederate and Union war dead. Northern papers took notice. The Washington Intelligencer opined. The action of the ladies on this occasion in burying whatever animosities or ill feeling may have been engendered in the late war towards those who fought against them is worthy of all praise and commendation. This widely reported action is seen by some historians to have inspired a movement of reconciliation that was part of the motivation behind Logan's 1868 proclamation. Others argue that Lincoln began the process of reconciliation and grave decoration when he dedicated the Gettysburg battlefield on November 19, 1863. For its part, in 1966, Congress officially recognized Waterloo, New York as the first community to set aside a community-wide annual observance of a day dedicated to honoring the war dead, starting in 1866. The problem is that the Waterloo story is difficult to prove. Some historians argue that the Waterloo story is more legend than fact. Regardless of where the tradition started, one important part of the history of Memorial Day in the United States is the significant difference in which the day was celebrated in the North versus the South. In the period immediately following the Civil War, while the North tended to focus on the idea that Union soldiers had sacrificed themselves in the cause of freedom, celebrations in the South increasingly turned towards supporting a set of beliefs referred to as the lost cause of the Confederacy. The idea of the lost cause minimized the role of slavery as a cause for the war and presented the Southern cause as a defense of an idyllic way of life from intrusion. Confederate soldiers and leaders were presented as if they were chivalric knights fighting against overwhelming odds. The tradition of commemorating war dead allowed an opportunity to reinforce this set of beliefs. The idea of the lost cause is significant in post-war America. While most historians agree that it reinforced white supremacist attitudes and helped a Southern elite re-establish power, there's also wide agreement that the philosophy helped to heal over, or at least to plaster over, the wounds of the war during the difficult period of Reconstruction, and helped to move the nation back to the unity of purpose, which would be required to face the challenges of the coming century. The narrative, however, ignored many historical realities, and that can be seen in modern conflicts today over things like the display of the Confederate battle flag or Confederate monuments. What it most means to this historian is that the issues that drove the conflict of the U.S. Civil War did not magically disappear when the Confederate armies surrendered. And the fact that those issues are still around today is all the more reason why we should learn and know the history that is intertwined with the way that our nation commemorates its war dead. Memorial Day is unique in the way that Americans understand our history. It is a rare day that is set aside for Americans to remember their history, and yet its cause and date harken back to the most divisive period in our history. And it also symbolizes the sacrifice and heroism on behalf of our most revered values. Such shared values ground our national identity. Perhaps one of the best ways to understand Memorial Day is to understand the surprisingly little-known flag tradition of Memorial Day. By tradition, on the morning of Memorial Day, the United States flag is briskly drawn to the top of the staff and then solemnly lowered to half-staff in recognition of the more than 1 million men and women who sacrificed their lives in the service of our country. But then, at noon, the flag is again drawn to the top of the staff as a symbol that the living are resolute in not allowing that the sacrifice of our war dead will have been in vain, and a promise that we will rise up in their stead and continue the fight for the cause of liberty and justice. Around the world, nations remember their fallen soldiers in different ways. Many of them set aside time to do so on November 11th, which is the anniversary of the armistice that ended the Great War. We recognize that in the United States as Veterans Day, whereas Memorial Day remembers those who died serving in the United States Armed Forces. Veterans Day remembers all those who served in the U.S. Armed Forces. I'd like to dedicate this episode to my great-uncle George, who my dad is named after, and who I always thought I would have liked, but I never got to meet. He's one of the more than 1 million American young men who marched off to war and never came home, who deserve to be remembered. Today is Memorial Day. It's actually a coincidence that this year Memorial Day lands on May 30th. From 1868 to 1970, Memorial Day was officially recognized to be May 30th, but since 1971, it's been recognized as the last Monday in May. It is a day of remembrance. According to the United States Department of Veteran Affairs, the day commemorates those men and women who have died in the nation's service. Among those was Captain Eddie Grant of the 307th Infantry Regiment. Captain Grant's is just one story that reminds us why we commemorate Memorial Day. One story of the millions who have given their lives in this nation's service, who deserve to be remembered. It was October 1918, and the attention of the people of the United States was on the Argonne Forest and the men of the Lost Battalion. The Meuse-Argonne Offensive was part of the massive Allied 100 Days Offensive, intended to be the final offensive to end the Great War. The Meuse-Argonne sector was largely the responsibility of the Americans, whose strength added to the Allies was seen as key to the final defeat of Germany. The offensive eventually included some 1.2 million Americans. By some measures, it was the largest and deadliest battle in the history of the United States military. The importance of the battle was well understood by the largely untested American Expeditionary Force. The standing order was simple. Ground, once captured, must under no circumstances be given up. The saga of the Lost Battalion began the morning of October 2nd. Some 545 men of the 77th Infantry Division were tasked with taking Hill 198. They took the hill in a day of hard fighting, but the units on both flanks were hit by strong counterattacks and driven back. The group was surrounded. Despite the name, in fact, the Lost Battalion was not a single battalion, but 9 companies of the 154th Infantry Brigade of the 77th Infantry Division, representing parts of 4 different battalions. The 77th Infantry Division had originally consisted of draftees, mostly from New York City. Its shoulder sleeve insignia showed the Statue of Liberty, and it was thus called the Liberty Division, or the Metropolitan Division. The senior commander of the 9 companies was Major Charles Whittlesey, a Harvard-trained lawyer and commander of the 1st Battalion of the 308th Infantry Regiment. In reality, the Lost Battalion was never lost. Whittlesey knew their position throughout. It was the rest of the Allied armies that didn't know where they were. While itself a small part of the offensive, the saga of the Lost Battalion was very important to the Allies, and particularly to the men of the American Expeditionary Force. Rescuing the battalion would mean a significant achievement, demonstrating that the American Army was the match of its more experienced allies. Whereas, if the battalion were to be forced to surrender, it could undermine Allied faith in the Americans. Both sides knew the score. The Americans made repeated attacks, trying to relieve the battalion. The Germans desperately opposed those attempts while employing some of its best troops, including an elite battalion of stormtroopers, trying to force the battalion to surrender. It was a desperate fight. The 308th Infantry Regiment alone lost 766 men in attempts to reach Whittlesey's force. The attack captivated the nation, and the force held until it was relieved on October 7th after being encircled for 5 days. For the Americans, it was one of the most famous events of the war. But the story that is familiar is only partially told. The Boston Post opined in November 1918. When the now famous beleaguered Lost Battalion was surrounded in the trackless jungle of the Argonne, not a morning nor an afternoon passed without its fierce, devoted attempt by a brother regiment to cut its way through the encircling Germans. An unending succession of assaults, which finally, and just in time, brought up the delayed relief. Yet, as with other historic sieges, the spotlight of history hovers now, and will always hover over the people besieged. It leaves in the half-shadow the forces marching to the relief, and probably never will be written the full story of the sacrifice and endurance which made that relief possible. How again and again the attempt was made to find a weak place in the German grip on the ravine. How the Americans fought through swamps and up steep hills, made impossible by scores of invisible machine guns. That is the story. Whittlesey himself knew the sacrifices made on behalf of his men. The Post continues. When several days later the scribes of the battle made their way to that ravine where Major Whittlesey, commander of the beleaguered battalion, was camped, he met them with words that ran something like this: "The real story is not here. The real story is with the men who day and night fought their way to our relief." Among those was another Harvard-educated New York City lawyer by the name of Edward Leslie Grant. Eddie Grant was born May 21st, 1883, in Franklin, Massachusetts. He attended Harvard University, where he played on both the baseball and the basketball team. He graduated with his undergraduate degree in '05, but continued at Harvard to study law. He got his Major League Baseball start shortly after his 1905 graduation. Slugger Nap Lachue was such a star player for Cleveland's Major League team that the team was literally named for him, the Cleveland Naps. But he suffered an ankle injury towards the end of the 1905 season, and Eddie Grant was brought on board as an emergency replacement. Grant would end up playing 990 games in the major leagues with Cleveland, Philadelphia, Cincinnati, and the New York Giants. Over that period, he finished his law degree at Harvard in 1909. In the off-season, he would practice law in New York and Boston. Grant was a solid player, and during his best years playing second base in Philadelphia, he was a fan favorite and a standout. The St. Louis Star and Times noted he was the most dangerous man on the Phillies, and he held the reputation for years. In one streak in 1909, he hit 7 straight plate appearances in a single day in a doubleheader against the New York Giants. That record wasn't beaten until 1952, and not beaten in the National League until 1992. He was also a good fielder, excelled at stealing bases. The Los Angeles Evening Express wrote he was the sort of chap that never gave up, no matter how big the odds were against his side. But his contribution to baseball was in more than his play. Because of his education, he was called Harvard Grant. His education made for his notable eccentricity. When calling a fly ball, instead of shouting the common, "I got it," he used the more grammatically correct, "I have it." His education had meaning in the early years of professional baseball. The Star and Times wrote, Eddie Grant was a credit to the national game he helped so much to uplift. He was among the first of the college boys to take up professional baseball, and it was their entrance into the game that raised the standard of the sport. The newspaper goes on, at the time that Eddie decided to become a professional player, baseball was not in very high repute. Grant would help to change that image. The Evening Express wrote, as is characteristic of college-bred athletes, he was, first of all, a gentleman. The Star and Times opined, the example set by Grant and the other collegians changed the sentiment towards the game and lifted the game to its present level. The benefits that have accrued to baseball by the entrance into it of Eddie Grant and his fellows are inestimable. He might not have been the flashiest player. In fact, you might never have heard his name, and yet Eddie Grant deserves as much credit as anyone for making baseball America's pastime. But maybe just as important, he was simply a good fellow. He was known for being a friend to rookies, helping younger players. He played unselfishly, and the Star and Times noted, never in his life had Eddie Grant anything but a good word to say about anyone. The Evening Express wrote, without a doubt, Grant was one of the most modest chaps that ever played baseball. While his hitting faded and his batting average decreased, he continued to be a well-regarded fielder, playing shortstop in Cincinnati, and then in 1913 was traded to the Giants. His career was towards its end, but he made appearances as a pinch hitter and pinch runner in the 1913 World Series. In 1915, he retired from baseball and dedicated his time to his practice of law. When the U.S. entered the Great War in 1917, Eddie Grant was 35 years old, too old to be drafted. He easily could have sat out the war, or, as many other baseball players chose, served working in home industry, a so-called shipyard job. But that was not how Harvard Eddie lived his life. The Washington Post wrote, to a man of Eddie Grant's type, there was only one thing to do when war was declared, and that was to get into action. There would have been no shipyard job for Eddie. Grant decided to train to be an officer, attending the same Plattsburgh training camp that Charles Whittlesey and fellow Harvard Law School graduate Theodore Roosevelt Jr. did. The website of the New York Giants Preservation Society quotes a letter he wrote to a friend. I am going to try to be an officer. I don't know how much of a success I shall make of it. The sort of chap who never gave up was confident of victory. He wrote his sister, the Germans won't be able to win a game from us. We would knock old Hindenburg out of the box in the first inning. Grant was commissioned a captain of Company H of the 307th Infantry Battalion of the 77th Infantry Division. A company of his battalion, Company K, was among the 9 companies besieged with Whittlesey. Harvard Eddie was the same gentleman fighter at war that he had been on the baseball diamond. The Boston Post wrote, the men of Company H testify that they never went into action without their captain in the lead, and one of them, he used to be a traffic policeman on duty at the Polo Grounds in New York, says that to the onlooker there never was any difference between the Captain Grant who walked forward, smiling and unconcerned under shell fire, and the Eddie Grant of old, trotting up from the bench to third base. Army Chaplain Henry Wacker wrote of him, Captain Grant was the most popular man in the 307th Infantry, well beloved by his men who would follow him wherever he led the way. He had no fear of death, going where duty and honor called him.
Company H was involved in the bloody operation to rescue the lost battalion from the start. By the third day of the siege, Company H had been in continuous combat for nearly 4 straight days. Like his men, the stalwart captain was exhausted. In fact, Grant's men had attempted to send the captain back to an aid station to rest. The Post writes, they had seen by his white, drawn face how utterly he was exhausted. They had watched while he started several times to drink his coffee and then let the cup stand, literally too weary to lift it to his lips. They had tried to persuade him to go back to the aid station and rest even for a little time, but he paid no heed to them. Lieutenant Lloyd Neese wrote in a letter to Grant's father, I saw him only 5 minutes before the attack and insisted that he go to the hospital as he was suffering from bronchitis and was very hoarse. But he refused and said, when we get relieved, we'll go. The 307th suffered greatly in the attempts to relieve the lost battalion. The Post continues, his company, which had been in the thick of the fighting on the Vesle River, which had had a part in every attempt to relieve the boys of the lost battalion, was moving forward for the 6th attack when the wounded major, being carried past on a litter, directed Captain Grant to take command. The Scranton Tribune explained, on the way through the forest, fighting at every step, Grant came upon stretcher bearers carrying back the major commanding the battalion who had been wounded. The major called to Grant, take command of the battalion. Eddie Grant was one of the few officers left. Now in acting command of the 3rd Battalion of the 307th Infantry Regiment, Grant did what he had always done. He led. The Germans were determined to beat back the assault, and their artillery rained down on the men of the 307th. A shell exploded, injuring 2 lieutenants, one of them Grant's adjutant. He yelled for his men to get down, to take cover, but he himself remained standing, calling for a stretcher for his fallen adjutant, when a second shell exploded. The Scranton Tribune wrote, he was calling and waving his hands when the shell struck him. It was a direct hit. Grant's body is buried in the Argonne Forest, a few yards from where he fell. His final resting place is marked by a pile of stones and a rude cross. Lieutenant Neese wrote, his death was a great loss to the division. I personally looked after his burial and had some sod put around his grave, the best I could do under the circumstances. He is buried in a beautiful place. The Post reported in the course of those attacks many officers and men were killed or wounded. In leading one of them, Captain Grant of H Company, 307th Infantry, was struck dead at the head of the battalion. This was Eddie Grant of the Giants, Eddie Grant of the Philadelphia Nationals, Eddie Grant for the old Cincinnati Reds. He was one of the players whom baseball knew no more after the first call to arms was sounded across America. The Los Angeles Evening Express wrote, Grant didn't wait to be drafted. He enlisted as soon as we entered the war. He was the first baseball player to die for Uncle Sam. The Washington Post wrote, the umpire supreme over all has called its last strike on Eddie Grant. He was a fighter to the last ditch, was Eddie Grant. He was the highest type of baseball player, and he was the real type of an officer and gentleman. Baseball gave of its best in Captain Grant, and now he has given up his life for one of the greatest causes for which man ever fought. Baseball fans are justly proud of Eddie Grant. His passing is mourned by all who knew him. Almost as soon as Grant's death was reported, there were calls to have a memorial built at the Polo Grounds, the stadium where the Giants played. Harry Elwood Moose McCormick, a future Hall of Famer who had also served in France as a captain with the 167th Infantry Regiment, sent a telegram to fellow professional baseball player Sam Crane. Suggest suitable memorial for Eddie Grant's biggest sacrifice. The honor came on Memorial Day, May 30th, 1921, 101 years ago today. The New York Giants Preservation Society notes, within weeks of the news of Grant's death, new reports told of a campaign to honor the fallen ballplayer with a memorial to be located at the Polo Grounds, the last place he called home as a big leaguer. By February 1919, the Edward L. Grant Memorial Association was formed, led by baseball executives, players, military officers, and sports writers. Its purpose to erect a lasting and suitable edifice to the former infielder. Between games of a Giants doubleheader against the visiting Phillies, the Grant Monument was unveiled, with 30,000 watching from the Polo Ground stands. A flag was removed by one of Grant's sisters, Florence Grant Robson, revealing the monument, its inscription highlighted by the line, Soldier, Scholar, Athlete. The Giants played their last game at the Polo Grounds in September of 1957, before moving to San Francisco. According to the New York Times, apparently after the game, Giants fans pillaged their team's former field and the plaque disappeared. While there were reports that the plaque had been recovered by police, and even reports in 1997 that it had been recovered from the basement of a former police officer's home, The original plaque has never been found.
Eddie Harvard Grant, who played such an important role in early baseball and gave all for his country, is mostly forgotten today. And yet his story is one of millions that deserves to be remembered this Memorial Day. Dulce et decorum est pro patra mori. The Naval War is a relatively overlooked part of the Great War, lost in the drama of a worldwide conflict and with few large fleet actions. Yet in many ways the war swung on the battle at sea, as both the Entente and Central Powers sought to starve the other through naval blockade. There are many compelling stories of the efforts to defend commerce from the U-boat menace, but the contributions of the United States Coast Guard, which had only been officially created in 1915, is an even more forgotten part of the conflict. And yet the Coasties served and died in the Battle of the Atlantic. On September 26, 1918, the United States suffered its greatest naval combat loss of life of the First World War. The loss of the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Tampa is history that deserves to be remembered. The revenue cutter Miami was one of two authorized in 1910 and built by the Newport News Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company. Contrary to appearance, the boat was not named after the city of Miami, Florida, but like many revenue cutters, was named after a Native American peoples, the Algonquin-speaking people indigenous to the Great Lakes called the Miami. 190 feet long, with a beam of 32.5 feet and a draft of 14 feet, the 1,181-ton displacement vessel was armed with three 6-pounder rapid-fire guns. With her 1,260-horsepower vertical triple-expansion steam engine, she could make 16 knots. Established as the Revenue Marine in 1790 for the purpose of customs enforcement, the service was renamed the Revenue Cutter Service in 1890. By then, the role of the service had broadened, and the Miami, according to the 2017 book Tampa's Own, published by the Tampa Bay History Center, was part of the Revenue Cutter fleet and worked in South Florida, the Gulf of Mexico, Florida Straits, Key West, and Tampa, collecting customs duties and tonnage taxes and deterring smuggling. The Miami was very active from her launch in 1912. In addition to customs duties, she rescued ships in distress, towed or destroyed derelicts that were a hazard to shipping, and in 1915 captured a ship running guns to Mexico. In 1913, Miami was assigned to what would become the International Ice Patrol, established in response to the 1912 sinking of RMS Titanic. Among her many duties, perhaps her most unique at the time was, of course, fighting pirates at what has been described as the Bay Area's biggest party, the Gasparilla Pirate Festival. Inspired by an apocryphal Spanish pirate named Jose Gaspar, supposedly the last of the buccaneers, the Tampa Bay Gasparilla Pirate Festival is a carnival-type celebration that was first held in 1904, and featuring an invasion by King Gasparilla. In 1913, the Miami was invited to participate in the festivities, where the Tampa Bay Tribune noted, the pirate ship fired a shot across Miami's bow, after which the commander of the Miami consulted with his officers and also with representatives of the city who were on board. In the end, he caused the flag of his ship to be dipped to the Pirate King in admission of the fact that he was to rule over the city of Tampa and the waters adjacent thereto for at least one day. The participation of the Miami in the festival became an annual occurrence and helped to establish the ship's relationship with the people of Tampa. The website of Hillsborough County, Florida writes, the ship and its crew had become fixtures at Gasparilla festivities, firing the cutter's cannons at a mock pirate ship during the latter vessel's annual invasion of the city. The booming exchange initiated the tradition of gun blasts that continues today. The Tampa's appearance also served as a Coast Guard recruiting tool, which largely is why 24 local men were crew members. Tampa's Own notes, many of the crew members were from Tampa and had joined the service when the ship was in port. They not only took part in the flotilla invasion, but were able to enjoy the parade and the fair. In 1915, Congress combined the Revenue Cutter Service and the U.S. Life-Saving Service to form the United States Coast Guard. That year, the Miami made headlines when she survived a thrilling ride in a West Indies hurricane by using a derelict vessel it was towing as a sea anchor. The following year, right before the Pirate Festival, the Miami was officially renamed Tampa in recognition of the boat's close association with the city. Tampa's Own reports. The Tampa Rotary Club hosted an elegant banquet for the newly named Tampa's officers and crew at the Tampa Bay Hotel and presented the ship with a silver service. The website of American Legion Post 5 of Tampa, Florida, describes the busy season for the crew of the cutter. 1917 was very eventful to the crew of Tampa. The South Florida Fair and the Gasparilla Carnival at Tampa was the greatest yet, lasting 9 days from February 2nd through the 10th. With 4 days to recuperate from the gala affair, they went on to patrol the annual boat regatta at Miami from the 15th through the 17th of February. On March 27th and 28th, they patrolled the races at St. Petersburg Yacht Club in St. Petersburg, Florida. But life was about to change for the Tampa and the nation. The website continues. There was a shadow over the spring gaiety of 1917, however. February 2nd, opening day of the fair and carnival in Tampa, was the day the United States broke off diplomatic relations with Germany. Perhaps the men of the Tampa sensed that they would be the last celebration with the citizens of Tampa, Florida. On April 6th, the United States declared war with Germany, and immediately the Tampa and other Coast Guard cutters were transferred to the Navy. The Tampa was refitted with newer, larger 3-inch guns, painted navy gray, and sent off to war. The historian of the United States Coast Guard notes that the Tampa, under the command of Captain Charles Satterlee, was one of 6 Coast Guard vessels that was assigned to do convoy duty in European waters during World War I. Satterlee had become a cadet with the Revenue Cutter Service in 1895, and by 1915 had achieved the rank of captain when he had taken command of the cutter. Satterlee was from Connecticut, but he had spent significant time in Tampa with the Revenue Cutter Service and was a familiar sight as the captain of the Tampa. Tampa's Own says of him, as he served as captain on the Tampa and was in our port, he would take showers at the hotel, write cards and letters home. Remember, he even received the Silver Service from the Rotary Club in 1916 at the Tampa Bay Hotel. Captain Satterlee was one of our boys, too. He was one of many. Tampa's Own continues. 3 sets of brothers and 2 cousins from Tampa were part of the Tampa's crew. The Mansfield boys, Frederick, age 17, and Percy, age 20, joined right out of Hillsborough High School. Leonard and William Bozeman were first cousins. The crew also included brothers Algie and Arthur Bevins. Tampa's Own notes that Algie worked for Furman Motor Cars, which had been a bicycle shop only 15 years before. The Furman family still owns the business today, a century later. Also on the crew were brothers Wambolt and Homer Sumner. September 2018 edition of the Tampa Bay Times says of the brothers, Wambolt Sumner, the ship's acting writer, hailed from Tampa. He loved to play baseball and always had a smile. He joined the Coast Guard out of guilt after his younger brother, Homer, enlisted. The crew also included 3 African Americans from the Tampa area, Eston Drew Legree, Herman Carmichael, and William Holland. Tampa's Own notes that the 3 had grown up just a few blocks apart. Notable on the crew were its youngest members. Vincento Guerriero was just 16. According to the Tampa Bay Times, he had signed up under the assumed name Jimmy Ross because he was afraid that his father would object to his enlistment. But the Times continues, Guerriero wasn't the youngest crew member, though. That distinction fell to 15-year-old Irving Slickland of New York City, son of a lawyer. Tall for his age, Slickland decided to enlist one day after school in March 1918. His grandmother was so appalled that she ran to the recruiting office in her bedroom slippers, followed by his father, but they couldn't get him released. His parents finally gave their reluctant blessing. In all, 24 members of the Tampa's normal complement of 70 officers and men hailed from Tampa. Tampa was assigned as an ocean escort to Squadron 1 of the Patrol Forces, commanded by Rear Admiral Albert P. Niblack. Writer Alexander Lazarly, a Coast Guard veteran, described the Tampa service in his 2003 book, The Coast Guard in World War I, An Untold Story. She was assigned ocean escort duty, protecting convoys from German submarines on the route between Gibraltar and the southern coast of England. On the average, she spent more than half of her time at sea and steamed more than 3,500 nautical miles, or 6,500 kilometers, per month. Between 27 October 1917 and 31 July 1918, she escorted 18 convoys between Gibraltar and Great Britain, losing only 2 ships out of all those escorted. Leslie notes that the Tampa brought her guns into action several times, but did not have a verifiable run-in with a U-boat. Wambolt Sumner wrote his family, "We see lots of sailors and soldiers from the States, and we have to tell them about all the subs, whether we have seen them or not." And in another letter, "We're out looking for Fritzes. Hope we get one." The duty was certainly not without risk. The history of the ship described in the U.S. Naval History and Heritage Command notes that on May 21st, there was a premature detonation from gun number 2, resulting in a mortal wound to one of the ship's coxswains, who died of his wounds the following day. When the cutter reached Devonport on 25 May, the body was landed and prepared for burial. This death prompted the assignment of a Navy surgeon to the ship's complement. Despite the wartime conditions, the crew sought to reassure their family. Algie Bevins wrote in a letter, "Both well, etc., and going about our duties without any fears. And it strikes me that if we can see nothing to be afraid of, why, you all should have no great cause to worry. The danger is no more here than in any other industry back home, so just put those petty fears aside and look at the bright side, always." In fact, the crew had other concerns. The Tampa Bay Times notes that Algie complained that his family wasn't writing him enough, and in September, Wambolt Sumner sent his family the happy news that he had presented his fiancée a 5-diamond ring and planned to marry her when he returned. The Tampa earned a stellar reputation for her service. In her 11 months' service, the ship had been at sea more than half the time and was known as one of the most efficient of the ocean escort force. On September 15th, Rear Admiral Niblack offered a commendation for that service. This excellent record is evidence of a high state of efficiency and excellent ship spirit and an organization capable of keeping the vessel in service with minimum shore assistance. The squadron commander takes great pleasure in congratulating the commanding officer, officers, and crew of the record that they have made. 2 days later, on September 17th, 1918, Tampa, in company with her fellow escorts, departed Gibraltar with the 32-ship convoy HG-107, bound for Liverpool. Robert Johnson, a professor of history at the University of Alabama, described the actions of the Tampa as the convoy approached its destination in his 1983 book, Guardians of the Sea, History of the United States Coast Guard. As the convoy stood in the Bristol Channel during the evening of 26 September, Captain Charles Satterley received the customary order to take the cutter to Milford Haven. Sometimes later, at about 8:45, the shock of an explosion was felt by several in the convoy. Seems not to have been important enough for the British destroyers to investigate, but when the Tampa failed to arrive at Milford Haven, escort vessels based there undertook a search. 3 days cruising along the cutter's probable track resulted in the recovery of 2 unidentified bodies and some floating wreckage. The fate of the Tampa only became known after the war, when the records of the German submarine UB-91 were recovered. The Tampa Bay Times summarizes the encounter. As dusk was setting in over the Irish Sea, a German submarine spotted a lone ship steaming towards England's Bristol Channel. The U-boat dived to attack. About half an hour later, it fired a single torpedo. In his battle notes, the commander, Captain Lieutenant Wolf Hans Hartwig, described the explosion. A black cloud of smoke, and a second explosion, maybe the depth charges aboard the ship. Then, Hartwig wrote, not to be seen anymore. Within 15 minutes, he had the submarine surfaced to search for survivors, bodies, or wreckage. Nothing found, he wrote. The Naval History and Heritage Command notes, all on board the cutter, 111 Coast Guard officers and men, 4 Navy sailors, and 14 British passengers were lost. The Coast Guard historian's officer says of the loss of the Tampa, the sinking of the cutter was the single largest loss of life for the Coast Guard during World War I. The sacrifices of her crew were not forgotten. The city of Tampa conducted a fundraising campaign, Remember the Tampa, in an effort to sell war bonds. In 1921, the Coast Guard christened a new cutter in her name. 7 years later, on 23 May 1928, the U.S. Coast Guard Memorial was dedicated at Arlington National Cemetery, honoring the sacrifice of those who had served aboard Tampa. The Punta Gorda Herald of Punta Gorda, Florida, wrote at the time, "Thus are the horrors of war brought home to us all, and Tampa and the friends and relatives of the dead have the sympathy of us all." The loss of Tampa and her crew was perhaps all the more tragic because of the timing. The Tampa was sunk less than 6 weeks before the end of the war. It is difficult to contextualize the loss of these 129 souls in the context of a war in which some 20 million people died. But the loss of the Tampa illustrates the horrors of that war. An April 2019 article in Stars and Stripes magazine tells the story of Anna Bonaparte, who was 4 years old when her father James Wilkie died on board the USS Tampa. Though she didn't have many memories of her father, she constantly spoke about him and his service in the Coast Guard, said her son, Wallace Bonaparte. A January 2001 edition of the St. Petersburg Times quoted Edwin T. Galvin, whose father and uncle served on the ship. Galvin says that his father transferred off a month before it sank and never got over the guilt. The ship left port here with his brother and his 2 best friends, Galvin said. He never saw them again. He talked about it through his tears many times. The Tampa Bay Times quoted Rodney Kite Powell, curator of the Tampa History Center. So many young men, 24 from the area, lost their lives in the blink of an eye. That was just devastating. Wham-Bolt Sumner's fiancée sent the 5-diamond ring that he had given her to his family. The Tampa Bay Times reports that it is now in the possession of his niece, given to her by her mother. The family never learned anything more about the betrothed, just that her first name was Jessie. All we know is her first name, said the niece. Her identity and how she decided she wanted my mother to have the ring, we will never know. In 1999, at the recommendation of retired Master Chief Petty Officer James C. Bunch, the Coast Guard began an ongoing project to identify family of the Coast Guardsmen killed aboard the Tampa and give them Purple Hearts. Stars and Stripes magazine explains that the Purple Heart wasn't authorized for the Coast Guard until 1942, and it wasn't until a decade later, in 1952, that it became possible to award it retroactively to 1917. And apparently, the Coast Guardsmen lost aboard the Tampa were overlooked at the time. In 1919, 5 Coast Guard patrol craft were named in the honor of the officers of the Tampa, and 2 U.S. destroyers have been named after Captain Charles Satterley. The name Tampa continues with the Coast Guard, most recently with the 270-foot medium-endurance class cutter in service since 1984. The Hillsborough County web page concludes, says the Coast Guard, few words carry as much weight in the annals of the history of the Coast Guard as the word Tampa. It was March the 6th, 1944, and the airmen of the United States 8th Air Force were conducting their 250th mission of the Second World War. The mission was important not just because of the milestone being the 8th's 250th mission, but also because of the enormous size of the raid, a stunning 1,758 airplanes involved, 814 bomber aircraft, and 944 fighter aircraft. To that date, the largest air armada ever assembled for a single mission in world history. And it wasn't just the mission's great size or the milestone of the 250th mission that made the mission interesting. The 8th Air Force was attacking the very heart of the German Reich. They were bombing the German capital city of Berlin in broad daylight. Berlin was arguably the most heavily defended target that the 8th Air Force would face during the Second World War. And the 250th bomber mission changed the face of that war, but at great cost. The mission that became known as Black Monday deserves to be remembered. It was not the first Allied bombing raid on Berlin. RAF Bomber Command had been carrying out raids, some very large, on the German capital since 1940. It was not the first U.S. 8th Air Force raid on Berlin. 3 days earlier, some 300 bombers had flown a mission there. But the raid on Berlin, March 6, 1944, was the first U.S. daylight bombing raid in force over the German capital. A raid of unprecedented scale over one of Hitler's most well-defended targets, some 500 miles from the 8th Air Force's bases in East Anglia. It was a mission intended, in the words of Ed Miller, a B-17 co-pilot in the 303rd Bomber Group, to let Hitler know that the 8th Air Force existed. The American strategic bombing strategy in the Second World War was designed around the Norden bombsight. The remarkable device used an analog computer that calculated the plane's ground speed and direction and was connected directly to the plane's autopilot. The device promised an ability to bomb accurately from high altitudes that was unprecedented. But the device depended upon sighting the target. To be used accurately, it had to be used during the day. Daylight raiding made the U.S. planes more vulnerable to anti-air defenses and attacks by fighter aircraft than the bombers of the Royal Air Force, who preferred night raids that were less accurate but subjected the bombers to fewer risks. Previous to 1944, bombers of the 8th Air Force were forced to conduct raids deep into Germany without fighter escort. Small fighter aircraft simply did not have the fuel capacity to accompany the large 4-engine bombers so far from their bases. Bombers instead counted on high altitude to protect them from the flak of the heavy anti-aircraft guns and tight bomber formations and the dozen heavy machine guns carried by the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses and consolidated B-24 Liberators to stave off the attacks by German Focke-Wulf FW-190 and Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters. The result was brutal to the air crews. The German fighters, firing heavy cannons with exploding shells and increasingly accurate German anti-aircraft fire, took a massive toll on U.S. bomber aircraft and their crews. A raid on October 14th, 1943, against a ball bearing factory in the Bavarian city of Schweinfurt had resulted in the loss of nearly a quarter of the B-17 bombers on the raid, a loss so dreadful that it became known to the 8th Air Force as Black Thursday. In 1942 and 43, a bomber crew of the 8th Air Force had a less than 1 in 5 chance of completing their 25-mission combat tour, meaning that some 80% would wind up killed, captured, or wounded so badly that they would be sent home. Army aviators had the highest casualty rate of the U.S. Armed Forces. But the Allied bomber offensive had changed in 1944. Long-range capable fighters, such as the North American P-51Ds and Republic P-47s, equipped with droppable supplemental fuel tanks, started to become available in large numbers, allowing fighter protection for bombers, even on raids deep into Germany. For the previous 2 years, the Allies had been trying to cripple the German Luftwaffe by attacking aircraft production. The strategy had largely been a failure, forcing Germany to relocate some production, but not slowing their output of airplanes. In fact, German production of fighter aircraft increased throughout the war, and the Bf-109 became the most produced fighter aircraft in history. But with the availability of long-range fighter aircraft capable of challenging the fighters of the Luftwaffe, the 8th Air Force's new commander, legendary pilot James Harold Jimmy Doolittle, planned to draw the pilots of the Luftwaffe into a battle and destroy them in a war of attrition. Where bomber groups once avoided enemy fighters, now they were seeking to force them to engage. The raid on the 6th started with clear weather for takeoff, something that Captain William R. O.B. O'Brien of the 363rd Fighter Squadron described as unique for England. The raid was massive, following Doolittle's strategy of maximum effort that meant that deploying every aircraft that was deemed combat ready. The entire bomber train stretched out over 93 miles. The bomber force was divided into 3 air divisions in more than 24 bomber groups flying from bases throughout East Anglia. The 1st and 3rd Air Divisions were comprised of B-17s, and so were grouped together, with the 242 B-17s of the 3rd Air Division following in the wake of the 262 B-17s of the 1st. They were followed by the 2nd Air Division, comprised of 226 B-24s, who were targeting aircraft factories in Genshagen, south of Berlin. The dangers faced by the crews were starkly illustrated when a B-24 of the 392nd Bombardment Group crashed on takeoff, killing its entire crew. For the rest of the bombers, the trip from bases in Britain to their targets in Berlin would take nearly 9 hours. Anti-aircraft fire, the dreaded flak, attacked the groups from the moment they crossed over the enemy coast. The clear weather gave out over the continent, with low scattered clouds making navigation difficult. O'Brien noted that he hadn't seen a recognizable landmark since the Zuider Zee Bay in Holland. In the scattered clouds, the 1st and 3rd Air Divisions became separated. The navigator on the lead plane of the 1st Division then made a mistake, failing to account for crossing headwinds. He led the 1st Air Division south of their intended route. The navigator of the lead plane of the 3rd Air Division made the correct calculations, putting the 2 divisions on different courses. The difference would result in tragedy for the more than 2,400 men in the 3rd Division. German radar had picked up the bomber groups as they crossed the channel. It recognized the gap between the 2 divisions and concentrated their fighters on the 3rd Division. The Allies, assuming the 1st Division would be the first to encounter the German defenses, had massed their defensive fighters over that division. The German fighters sent to intercept the Americans were now able to attack the 3rd Division, defended by just 8 P-47 fighters, with more than 100 Me-109s and FW-190s. The unit that bore the brunt of the attack was the van of the 3rd Air Division, bombers of Combat Wing 13B of the 418th Squadron of the 100th Bomber Group, based at RAF Thorpe Abbotts in Norfolk. 10 bombers were shot down in the first attack. Having studied the American bombers, the Germans favored attacking from the front, where the bombers were most vulnerable. With a closing speed in excess of 200 yards per second, the attack took less than a minute. An attacking FW-190 collided with a bomber from the 100th, nicknamed the Nelson King, nearly tearing off the bomber's rear stabilizer. Badly damaged, with only 2 engines operating, the crew realized they would be easily picked off if they tried to make it home alone. They dropped their bombs to reduce weight and followed the rest of the formations over Berlin. In all, 34 of the 242 bombers of the 3rd Division did not make it home. 121 were damaged, 3 beyond repair. 15 of the losses were from the 100th Bomber Group, which thereafter became known as the Bloody 100th. But the navigation issues had a surprising impact over Berlin. The 48 P-51Bs of the 357th Fighter Group, including O.B. O'Brien's, had missed their rendezvous with the bombers. Overshooting Berlin, when they got their bearings, they made a 180-degree turn, bringing them into Berlin from the east. It was a fortunate mistake. As they came over Berlin, they were in a perfect position to attack a group of Luftwaffe fighters that were heading for the bombers of the 1st Division. Doolittle's plan had worked. The Luftwaffe had no choice but to defend Berlin with all they had. Despite being a day raid, they had, for the first time, sent up night fighters in daylight. Designed to track bombers at night using radar, the twin-engine Messerschmitt 110 and 410 fighters were not as maneuverable as the P-51s, were easy targets. O'Brien attacked an Me-110 that he described as easy pickings. The diverting plane crashed into a building, and he later said, "You never saw such a fine explosion. It was plainly visible above 20,000 feet. But his guns jammed after that, and he was forced to make for home." Fighter opposition was described in action reports as some of the fiercest of the war. The Germans deployed as many as 1,000 fighters, some making as many as 5 sorties. A B-17 of the 457th Bomb Group, piloted by Lieutenant Eugene E. Whalen, was the victim of an attack by an Me-109. Whalen's plane exploded, crashing into the bomber piloted by Lieutenant Roy E. Graves. Out of both crews, only the tail gunner of Graves' crew survived. He was captured and held as a POW. The flak was thick over Berlin. Lieutenant Vern L. McClure, pilot of a B-17 nicknamed Thunderbird of the 359th Bomb Group, said over the target it looked like the 4th of July, flak bursting in red flashes and billowing out black smoke all around us. The flak over Berlin was the most accurate and most heavy flak we ever got into. It seemed almost thick enough to drop your wheels and taxi around on it. The raid, which historian Donald L. Miller called the greatest air battle ever, came at a huge cost for the 8th Air Force. 69 bombers and 11 fighters did not make it home. Several more managed to return to their bases, but were damaged beyond repair, among them the Nelson King. Hundreds more took significant damage. Moncour's Thunderbird took hits to 3 of its 4 engines in both its vertical and horizontal stabilizers. But his 359th Bomb Group benefited from fighter cover throughout, and all of its bombers returned home. They were among the lucky, though. The losses on Black Monday far exceeded the losses of Black Thursday the previous October. The 250th raid of the 8th Air Force represented the deadliest day for the 8th Air Force in the Second World War. Even worse, the weather and disruption by the Luftwaffe meant that most of the bombing attacks were off target. Allied headlines claimed that Berlin was without power, light, gas, or telephone service, but the bombing itself was actually ineffective. Ed Miller noted that photos showed that not one of the 303rd Bomber Group's bombs hit their target. But Black Monday nevertheless represented a turning point in the war. Despite their grievous losses to the 8th Air Force, the losses for the German Luftwaffe were much worse, losing nearly 170 fighters that day. In the battle of attrition, the Allies had a training pipeline for their crews and a manufacturing base that allowed them to make good their losses. The Germans, stretched thin across multiple fronts, did not. Between January 1944, when Jimmy Doolittle took over command of the 8th Air Force, and June 1944, when the Allies invaded Normandy, the German Luftwaffe lost more than 1,000 experienced pilots in combat. Jimmy Doolittle had drawn them into a battle from which they would never recover. Hermann Goering, Supreme Commander of the German Air Force, was reported to have said after the war, "The day I saw those Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the war was lost." I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.